Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Now, some stories are not imagined, they are remembered, not just events, but as experiences that shape how people see the world and who they become within it. And sometimes fiction becomes the way to explore those memories, more honestly than facts alone. Today, we are stepping into that space. I am joined by Frank S. Joseph, whose work revisits a turbulent period in American history not just to retell it, but to explore the human experience inside it. Frank, welcome to Thoughts at Last. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and greetings to all your listeners in Nigeria and every place else where they might happen to be.
Awesome. Now, Frank, before we kick things off, here on Thoughts at Last, I and my listeners, we want to get to know our guests on a personal level. So, if you don't mind, can you tell us more about yourself?
I'm an old guy, but not a dead guy. I,
Definitely not.
I was born January 17th, 1940 in Chicago, lying in hospital
Wow.
at 57th and Ellis, in the neighborhood that I write about in these novels. Um, I grew up the first 29 years of my life in Chicago, Illinois. At that time, the second largest city in America. Now the third largest, Los Angeles, surpassed it. Um, but it was the heartland of Chicago. It was the railroad capital when railroads went, in the railroad era when all trains
Yeah.
came to Chicago and you had to change trains. You could not go across country without getting
Wow.
off one train and getting on another in Chicago. It's a beautiful city along the lakefront, and noted for its architectural and its skyline. And I could say so many nice things about it before I say so many bad things about it. But
Yeah.
I lived in Chicago the first 29 years of my life, and these three novels, my Chicago trilogy, are, as you said in your introduction, they really draw on my life experience.
Wow. Thank you so much for letting us get to know you. And once again, Frank, welcome to Thought Atlas. Now, Frank, you lived through the period you write about. What made you choose fiction instead of, telling your story directly?
A couple of answers to that question. One is I don't think my life is interesting enough to write a memoir about.
Oh my.
Um, but I've discovered about myself that I'm a good noticer. And in those, in my life, particularly in my younger life, um, I think I was noticing things and, kind of mentally filing them in a filing cabinet I didn't know I had, so that when I sat down to write these novels, they uh, they emerged as the material, from which I drew.
Mm.
Another answer is I am a writer. I've been a writer all my life, one way or another. I was a creative writing major in college. I was on my high school newspaper. Um, at that time, I did think about a career in journalism, but decided it wasn't going to get me where I wanted to go. When I was 21 years old, envisioned myself as, starving in a garret and writing the great American novel. But when I was 22 years old and I graduated from college, I envisioned myself putting breakfast on the table, and I wound up going into journalism, and I don't regret a minute of it. I spent my the first half of my working life as a journalist in one form or another, and then I became a publisher and a marketing consultant and a direct marketing copywriter. And in late life, I finally started writing these novels, which I hadn't really written a word of fiction for 40 years after I graduated from college. But
Yes.
I don't think a day went by when I didn't at least think about the fiction I wasn't writing. And you get to a point in life, which in my case was in my mid to late 50s,
Yes.
when I realized if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. And I don't want to go to my grave not having done, with regrets.
Yes. Yes. I agree. Now, Frank, you've described taking who you were and shaping it into who you might have been. Now, what does fiction allow you to explore that reality doesn't? And what do you mean by who you were and shaping it into who you might have been.
Well, I kind of think of these novels as the what if my, not the story of my life, but the story of what if my life had been what if this had been my life? Because,
Okay.
I take real situations that I experienced, but I, put a twist on them, based on, a lot of things about the exigencies of writing a novel that will keep readers reading, against the things you want to say, the messages and morals and thoughts that you might want to slip in, the questions you want to ask. I don't think we're here. We fiction writers, we writers of entertainments, if you will. I don't think we're here to provide answers. I think we're here to ask questions.
Wow. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for that wonderful response. Now, Frank, growing up during a time of racial tension, what moments of experiences stayed with you the most?
Uh, I will tell a story. I've told this story before in other settings. Um,
Yes.
uh, and I'll just give you, before I do that, I'll give you the pitch for the trilogy, which I call my Chicago trilogy. And here's the pitch. These are tales of blacks and whites, Christians and Jews, how children view the world, conflict and forgiveness, and Chicago at mid-century, a great city going up in flames. Um, I was, I'm 6 years old. We live in a neighborhood called Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago. Barack Obama's neighborhood, where I grew up, was about 5 blocks from Obama's home.
Wow.
But about 30 blocks away, there is a neighborhood, then known sometime and now known as Bronzeville, where in my childhood, all the black residents of the city of Chicago really were forced to live. There were one or two other little spots, in the city where they could get housing, but almost probably 98% of the black people in Chicago were kind
Yes.
of forced to live in this 3 mile long, 1 mile, 1.5 mile wide neighborhood, uh, which became progressively more overcrowded, more crime infested,
Oh
schools
my.
deteriorating, living conditions deteriorating, um, no services. It was a pressure cooker. And this is partly because there was this great migration that started in the 1920s and went through the maybe 50s, maybe 60s, um, where black Southerners streamed up to northern manufacturing cities where there were great jobs,
Yes.
which they could get, and which paid better than anything they could get in the South. And in the
Yes.
South, if I'll remind your listeners, this is less than 100 years after slavery was ended in the American Civil War. Um, and the slaves were set free, but they really weren't, because not much changed after a brief period called Reconstruction. Things kind of reverted to where they were, and black people had bad lives in the South. It was not a friendly place. Uh,
Oh my.
and so, they came to cities like Chicago. And in Chicago, they found themselves kind of forced to live in Bronzeville, which became more and more crowded, and with all the issues that come with that. This
Yes.
neighborhood was about 30 blocks from where I grew up. And the story I was going to tell you, and I just gave you the background for it, but the story I was going to tell you in answer to your question was
Yes.
I'm 6 years old. And my dad and I are going to go down to Bronzeville, where my grandfather Nate owns a movie theater at 3507 South State Street, right in the middle of Bronzeville, and 4 blocks from the stadium where the Chicago White Sox play baseball. And we were all Sox fans. And my grandfather, who ran this motion picture theater 50 years, but never hesitated to take the afternoon off and go see a ball game, uh,
Yes.
and so this is something we did, and I have wonderful, warm memories of doing this with my grandfather and my father. So my dad and I are driving down there, and we approach the neighborhood, called Bronzeville, and my dad says, lock the doors. Now, I'm a 6-year-old kid, a white Jewish kid.
Yes.
And I really don't know what the heck he's saying because I'm only 6 years old, but the faces I see around me are black faces, not white faces. And I come to the conclusion that this is the most dangerous place on planet Earth.
Oh my.
And this is, the question you asked was, when did you start, something like, when did you start thinking about this? And, what are your thoughts
The,
about race relations? And, I kind of think of this as being sort of
the
I think
moments
the
or
right
experiences that
incident,
stay with you.
you know, the shot. I'm sorry, I was talking through you. Say that again.
Okay, I said during the moments or experiences that stayed with you the most during that time of racial tension
The experience I fear the most
that
is
stayed with you the most.
that was the question.
Yes, yes, that was the
Well,
question.
um, hmm, I I guess the experience I fear the most is kind of the experience that the second novel opens with, which is the white kid is out walking the dog at night, and he gets jumped by a bunch of black kids. Now,
All right.
truthfully, this never happened to me, but I
Yes,
think that is probably the experience that I would have feared the most.
yes.
And that's, such an incident is what opens the second novel, To Walk Humbly.
Wow. Okay, now you've witnessed white flight firsthand. First off, I don't know what white flight is. Can you describe that for us? And also, how did it shape your understanding of community and identity at the time?
Sure. Uh, I'm going to try and give you an adequate answer, but I'm sure I'm going to fall short. So,
Definitely,
keep
I wouldn't.
after me here. And once again, I have to fall back on the background of it. We're back in Bronzeville. It's
Yes.
1948. Uh, Conditions in Bronzeville are deteriorating by the day, and they can't do anything about it because there's a quasi law in force known as restrictive covenants, which permit landlords to rent to whomever they like, and if they wish to discriminate against whoever they like.
Oh
And
my.
in many cases, they discriminate against blacks, which is why the only place in Chicago where blacks can find a home to rent is in Bronzeville because every place else in the city, the whites aren't renting to blacks. Now, this happened to other minority groups too. There were suburbs in Chicago where restrictive
Yes.
covenants were entered against Jews, just for example. But these were private arrangements between landlords and tenants, but they had the force of law. Well, they didn't, they lost the force of law in 1948 or 1949 in a Supreme Court ruling that said, that made them illegal. So at that
Right.
point, these overcrowded, suffering black residents of Bronzeville realized they didn't have to stay there and they could find a better life for themselves. And the nearest place was my neighborhood. So, family by family, they start moving in on the western edge of Hyde Park, and slowly, slowly, they, move, more toward the lake, which is more, in the
Yes.
direction of where I lived. And what happens is the white families who and almost entirely populated Hyde Park start fleeing, and that's white
Oh,
flight. Um,
oh wow.
so, and that happened starting in 1950, and that's the engine that kicks off the second novel, To Walk Humbly, because my protagonist, Steve, is about to start high school, and he's going to go to Hyde Park High School, and his parents are discussing, do we want to stay or do we want to flee? And and I imagine that situation in the second novel, and they're talking to one another, and Steve is listening to this, he's overhearing it, and he says, yeah, but I'm going to go anyway, and even though I'm probably going to get my lunch money stolen from me, and
Yeah.
my friend Ricky calls it Hood Park, as in hoodlum, which was kind of Chicago's American slang for, bad guys. And
Yes.
the last words that Steve thinks is Hood Park. But he goes, and it doesn't come out quite the way he thought it was going. It doesn't come out the way quite that he feared.
Wow.
So what did I
So
miss in your question?
no, 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 I actually don't understand. I was just trying to understand, how white flight, what it is, and you already explained that. And I wanted to know how did it shape your understanding of community and identity at the time. I
Well,
can honestly,
my family didn't flee immediately. My friends
yes,
started fleeing around 1950 when this started. Yeah, but we stuck it out until I graduated from grammar school, which was in 1954 when I was
wow,
14 years old.
wow,
And I think we were one of the later families to stick it out. Not everybody left, of course, but a great many did. Finally, we did too. And most of my friends moved north to suburbs on the North Shore, but we didn't because my father's business was on the south side, and he didn't want to drive through downtown Chicago and fight traffic every day. So he
yes.
moved us south to a suburb called Park Forest, which is a separate story in itself. But I lived in Hyde Park till I was 14, and I didn't go to Hyde Park High. I went to the high school in Park Forest. Um, but in the novel, going back to what I said, early on, in the novel, I imagine that I did go to Hyde Park High and what that would have been like. And
Oh
this is kind
wow,
of fun, it's kind of fun to
yeah,
think about it because I can restructure my life any way I like. If I'm
yes.
writing a novel, I'm playing God there. That's the great thing about being a novelist.
Yes. Honestly, the reason why I love, the story of your life so much, even though I've not read your book, from the little you've told me, is the fact that you grew up during a time where, a lot of things were going on. I could say I grew up during a very boring time. I don't think I have a lot of experiences when I was younger. Life was mostly stable. Things actually began to happen from when I turned 15 up until now. It was from the age of 15 up until now that my country, just turned awry and lots of crazy things started happening. That's actually when the fun things started. But even then, I wasn't, directly in contact with the events that were going on in my country. It was just recently. Now, even up until now, I'm not in direct contact with it. Maybe it affects me indirectly, of course, but I've never really been, in the heat of where the stuff is happening, kind of. So I think that's it. So it's the more reason why I think your story is actually absolutely fascinating. As you were there, you experienced lots of things. You're able to remember most of. I can't even remember what happened from the age of 10 down. So to show you that there was really no profound experience, no profound thing that happened during those years. But you had a lot of experience, you experienced lots of things, and the fact that what if I had done this? There were lots of things you could have done at any certain age during the course of your life, but you picked the one that you picked that brought you up and led you to this moment that I'm now currently speaking with you. But in your books, you try to see, okay, what if at this age I had done this or I had done that? How differently would my life have turned out? I find it very much fascinating because it's almost as if you could continue to write different series or different books, and there would be no end because you could have made thousands upon thousands, if not millions of choices. So I truly don't understand. And I can imagine, although I cannot imagine because I grew up all the way in Africa, but I can try to imagine what it must have been like, being in a country that is multicultural, has a lot of history when it comes to, race, and how race is just a part of everything in the country. Even something as little as what people eat, how people dress, it's all bounded to race, and that's okay, that's fine. I mean, the dynamic of the American society, it's something that's absolutely fascinating, given that there's just so many things to explore about it. One thing that makes me happy though is the fact that people are becoming much more, would I say, more accepting, and less about race nowadays. But then again, from what I've been saying online, as to when it comes to my people, are the African Americans. I'm an African, so I don't know if they would accept me when it comes to the African Americans per se. I would say they still have a long way to go to improve their self and drop the mentality of whatever might have happened in the past and just move on and try to just move on, even if the system. In fact, I don't want to speak on things I don't understand because I've never really been to America. But what I'm essentially trying to say before I bring my talk to an end is I do understand what it must have been like for you, the experience and what's not. And like stereotypes don't come out of thin air, they come out of things that people do all the time. So going through, imagine the place is called, what did you, I think you called it Hood. Oh, there was a name you called it. Can you remind me, please, Frank? Hood something. I think you said Hoodsville. Was that
Hood
what you said?
Hood Park, Hood
Okay,
Park,
Hood Park. I mean, think about.
instead of Hyde Park, Hood Park.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, think about it, Frank. There's no way I would go. I would walk through Hood Park. I'm telling you for a fact. I would find another route. I would never go through Hood Park. So you can imagine. So I totally do understand. Even here in Africa, where I stay, there are places we avoid, people we definitely avoid. Even if sometimes not all of them are like that, but it's understandable that you wouldn't want to put yourself in harm's way, especially when you know you're a working man that is in charge of family, or you are the son of a mother and whatnot. So what I want to ask you next is, you eventually became a journalist and you covered the riots. Now the riots, it almost sounds very vague. Is it a specific riots that you covered? And how did seeing those events up close change your perspective about life and people in general?
That experience completely changed my life. That was a turning point in my life. When
Yeah,
I was in my 20s, I became a journalist after I graduated from college. And my first job was at a training ground known as City News Bureau of Chicago, which was basically where you learn how to be a reporter, and
yes,
people, the average kid lasts 6 months at City News and goes on to something else. I stayed there I was there 6 months, went into the army for 6 months, came back out, and went back to City News for another year just because I loved it so much. It was such
yes,
fun. I mean, here I am. You talk about being sheltered. You're right. A lot of things were happening in America at that time, and I was, they were really remote from my little sheltered, you know,
yes.
coddle growing up. But man, when you become a reporter and
It's a different case.
you find yourself hanging out in police stations from 5 in the afternoon till 2 in the morning, and rubbing shoulders with cops from completely different backgrounds than any you've known, and covering fires and seeing dead bodies floating on the Chicago River, and houses burning to the ground before your eyes and stuff like that.
Oh
Um,
my.
I mean, it's eye opening, and
Yes.
and but if you can stand it, which it turns out I was able to,
Wow.
it's an adrenaline high every day you go to work. And truthfully, most of the time, you're not doing anything. You're just sort of sitting around. But then, the bell clangs and you slide down the pole and, jump on the truck and go fight the fire. It's just like that for the average reporter, or at least, if you're covering spot news. Um,
Yes.
but then I went to the Associated Press, which was really where I learned how to be a journalist. That was my journeyman years, the 3 years I spent at the AP, um, which, of course, as you know, and I'm sure most of your listeners know, is a worldwide news organization, probably the largest news organization in the entire world. And it
Wow.
serves newspapers and broadcast stations the world over in every country except a few places, possibly places like North Korea, but almost
Yeah.
every
Yeah.
country in the world. um, and and I was in the Chicago Bureau, which is a major bureau, and we covered the state of Illinois, which is the state where Chicago is located, and much of the Middle West, which is the region in which Chicago is centered. And again, but there, I was lucky enough to have a mentor, a lovely person a guy named Joe Dill who sadly died at age 63, and I miss him, all the time.
Oh
He
my.
major force in my life, and the person I am today was formed in those 3 years at the AP. The habits of mind, uh, the struggle to stay impartial despite your beliefs, and not let your beliefs, color what you say and do when you're trying to cover the news, because the AP, that was
Yes.
one of the things about working for the AP was you had to write it down the middle because you were serving every outlet in the world. Some were very conservative, some were very liberal, some were right down in the middle. You wanted these stories to be published by everybody so everybody could read them. So fairness, impartiality, and the word used then was objectivity, uh, was paramount. And it was a great thing to learn, to put your prejudices behind you when you're talking to somebody with whom you might really have basic disagreements, but you're sitting there, you have to ask intelligent questions and draw the person out and respect, what you hear, and balance it off against the other things that you hear, and then synthesize it into 350 words for the A-wire. Well,
Wow.
well and good. But, in 1965, all hell broke loose. Uh, the riots began in, poor neighborhoods, mostly on the west side of Chicago, neighborhoods that were all entirely or almost entirely black, neighborhoods that were poor, neighborhoods were just like Bronzeville, as I described it before, with rotten
Yes.
schools and rotten police and police that people couldn't trust with good reason, because the Chicago police were very corrupt in those years. Uh, and and these neighborhoods just exploded. Well, I covered endless numbers of these riots, and you'd go out at night, and I started seeing, over time, I started seeing a pattern to the way they went, but it was going into a combat zone, and I was scared,
Yes.
rightfully so. I didn't have a gun, I didn't have a helmet, I didn't have a gas mask. I
Wow.
had a pad and a pen, and I just had to take it on faith that nobody would hurt me, which was true, and it did. Although I did get shot at one time, luckily,
Wow.
luckily they missed.
Oh my God.
I think I got shot at more than one time. There was another time when I was well, I'll get to that. I don't want to digress too much here. But
Okay.
no, I mean, I didn't get hurt. But man, it takes a certain amount of courage to go into these situations with nothing
Yes.
but a pad and a pen, and, stand there and watch what you see and stop people and ask them questions.
I mean, Americans would even say it takes a lot of guts.
Yeah.
So
Nowadays, sad to say, nowadays journalists are being killed. They're being,
oh
they're
my.
being targeted in places like Gaza and possibly your country. I don't know, but
Yes.
it's become a really seriously dangerous job. But luckily, when I was a journalist in the city of Chicago, it felt dangerous, and God knows it was. But stuff like that, nobody tried. Well, that one time somebody shot at me. Maybe they were trying to kill me. I don't know.
Oh
Anyway,
my God.
the question, I'm not answering the question. The question you asked was, how did this change your life? Well, um, it was particularly the riots, because I would go out there and I would see people smashing store windows with impunity, going in, grabbing arms full of stuff, running out, and laughing, high-fiving their buddies and laughing.
Honestly, I find that absolutely just crazy because you are fighting for change, but you are destroying infrastructure, things that are supposed to help you in your everyday life. You are destroying.
Well, thank you. That's exactly right. And in the novel, when my character describes this for the first time, she says exactly the same thing. She says, "What are these people going to do for breakfast tomorrow morning? What are they going to do when the food shop they go to is burned out?" And
Yes.
and And that's exactly right. But there's a euphoria going on, especially in that first night. Um, and people are just fi feeling liberated, and they're just having a great time. And I don't think they're thinking about consequences like the one you just raised. Uh, it isn't until, the reality does sit in at some point pretty darn soon, but not on that first night. So I was watching stuff like this, and then, my job was to go back and write about it in 350 words for the A-Wire, and
Yes.
I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it justice. I couldn't do it justice because I didn't understand what I had seen with my own eyes. And I mean, it was swell. It was the 60s, which is a very turbulent time, a time of tremendous political change when some people actually thought a revolution might take place in the United States. And I wondered about it myself at various points. Um, the uh, Vietnam War was heating up, which was a point of tremendous turmoil. The woman I was in love with at the time was a political
Yes.
radical, and she was filling my mind with, a lot of new ideas that I hadn't taken account of.
Yes.
And long and short of it was, I felt I was at a loss here, and I wasn't, I was never going to be able to answer these questions as a journalist. And so I made a tremendous, change in my life. I decided to leave journalism and go back to school and get a PhD in political science and become a professor and spend the rest of my life trying to write about and understand the riots. Um,
Wow.
which that was a big turning point in my life, obviously. But what I discovered, and I did do that, I got into the University of Chicago by great good
Yes.
luck, or at least it seemed like good luck when I got in. When I got there, I discovered, I thought I was bringing something to the University of Chicago, all this experience, all this street experience, and that I'd seen firsthand with my own eyes, and that lasted about 17 seconds. You know, they could care less. I quickly discovered at this really ivory tower place that if it didn't happen in a book, it didn't happen.
Oh
And
my.
yeah, and and add to that that winter in Chicago is really a miserable time. It snows and the wind blows, and they don't call it the Windy City for nothing. And it's dark and it's cold, and I had no friends. Uh, and also, school was hard. I'd been out of school for 5 years.
Wow.
I'd lost these habits of study. So I was in a kind of a panic at this point. And and I guess that panic got me through the first quarter because I got all A's, and including in one course I was taking, the reputation was nobody got an A in this course, but I got one. And so I got through the first quarter, and I had some grant money that helped me get through, but the grant was pulled at the end of the first quarter because the economy turned and the money just suddenly became not available. And the relationship that I was in with this woman I loved broke up, and it was winter in Chicago, and I had no friends, and I was feeling like, what am I doing here? And I fell into a deep depression that really lasted for the 2 years that I was at the University of Chicago. And my grades, I started taking pass fail instead of grades. And I
Yes.
stumbled through the coursework for the master's degree. And I got to the end of the master's degree and I started writing my thesis. And I never even finished it. And I never even really got the degree, although I did finish the coursework for the master's degree. And the thought
Wow.
that that quickly discovered was, I need to get back into journalism, where
Yes.
I was happy. Because when I left the AP, I was night city editor. After 3 years, that was a pretty nice title. I was covering big stories. I was so lucky as to be at the place where history was being made. Uh, and not just then, there were other times too in my journalistic career, and I was very lucky in a lot of the things that happened to me. And I just wanted to get back to it. So I had come to Washington to do research for my master's paper. Um,
Yes.
and I was in Washington for 3 weeks, going to a repository called the National Archives during the day and partying at night. And
Oh,
Washington, I said, "Wow, Washington, this is where I gotta be." So that's
yeah.
how I got to Washington. It took a while. It took some months of finagling before I was able to break free from Chicago. But I left Chicago in 1969 and came to Washington, and that's where I still am.
Oh, wow, that's absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, Frank. Now, Frank, I want to ask, your work explores both hatred and hope. Do you think it is important to, to hold on to hold these two together in the same story?
Why? Well, it's kind of fundamental, isn't it? If we don't have hope, what is there?
Actually, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
hope is very important.
Yeah, hope is important, but I mean, say the question again. I want to give it. I want to give it. I want to give you a better answer.
Okay, your work explores both hatred and hope. So I was asking why it is very important to hold on to these two together in the same story.
I I'm gonna answer with another story. I covered, you know who Dr. Martin Luther King is, I'm sure.
Yes.
I covered Dr. King maybe a dozen times during this period. He had come to Chicago from Atlanta, Georgia, and taken up residence. He thought the successes that he had in the South, he could duplicate in the North. That didn't turn out to be the case. Um, Dr. King's Dr. King found that
Sorry.
Chicago was not Atlanta, and things were different there. And what had worked for him in the South didn't necessarily work for him in Chicago. But what he did was he moved into a slum on the west side, right, pretty much in the heart of the riot zone, um, in a slum apartment, and made that his headquarters. And we covered him a lot. And one of the things he did, maybe the biggest thing he did while he was in Chicago, symbolically, the biggest effort that he made was he conducted an open housing march through a white neighborhood called Gage Park, uh, where it was all white, and
Mhm.
he wanted to do something. He wanted to make a big gesture, and so he had this open housing march, this demonstration through the main street in Gage Park, and all the residents came out and taunted him and threw things at him and so forth. I covered that. I covered that event, and it was I never saw such hatred in my life.
Oh my God.
It was blood curdling. It was chilling. The looks on the faces of these people were were just terrifying. 40-year-old moms and pedal pushers and 11-year-old kids
Yes.
spitting on them and stuff like that. And it just it I think of it now, and I can just bring it all back to my mind so many years later. Um, I write about this, I write about this too in the second novel. And I write about it pretty factually. Um, and during that, Dr. King got hit in the head with a rock. Somebody threw a rock, and it struck him in the forehead, and he needed medical attention. He wasn't
Oh my
badly
God.
hurt, but he was hurt. I think he was probably hospital. He was taken to a
Yes.
hospital and got a stitch or two. But afterwards, he said, uh, in all the places I'm not going to quote him directly because I don't remember the exact words.
Yes.
But he said, he said basically what I said. I have never seen such hatred on people's faces. Uh, and um, and so I write about, I try and reconstruct this march as well as I can, but what I fictionalize in this march is that my character, Pinky, who is an 11-year-old girl of mixed race,
Yes.
is at the head of the march, hand in hand with Dr. King. And she's terrified because she actually kind of almost doesn't even know why she's there. But she is an extraordinary person. She is a ghetto kid. Is she is, you know, being I'm going to say something very politically incorrect here, but I have to say
Okay.
it this way because I think it's the best way to put it. She looks white and thinks black. She's very
Oh wow.
light-skinned, and is taken for white all the time. But she's been raised by a woman. She's been raised in this one of these slums. The first place that had the riot. It was where the first riot started, where it actually did start. I situate her there in the novel. So
Yes.
she, well into the novel, the march takes place, and she has been taken into Dr. King's headquarters, where she is told she is going to be at the head of the march with Dr. King, symbolizing, the unification of the races. People will see in her face, black and white, in harmony.
Yes.
But she is just terrified. And then they start throwing things, and she just is, everything breaks up. When Dr. King gets struck by the rock, the march just collapses and Pinky runs away. Um, uh, so, but she's reunited with her baby sister, who's also, unbeknownst until it ends, also in the
Yes.
march just behind her. And, this is kind of the hatred and the hope thing right there. It's sort of encapsulated just in that one little segment of my novel.
Wow.
If you don't write about the hatred, if you don't write about, I mean, that's real. It's real. It's what I am writing about. I'm writing about these riots, and, there's a lot of hatred motivating them. Although
Yes.
they weren't race riots, a race riot in the sense of black and white, fighting one another. They really weren't. The newspapers called them race riots, but they really weren't. What they really were was property riots.
Oh
What
wow.
they really were was, cries for help, cries of frustration, cries of, you know, frustration, I think is the right word, because the people who lived in these neighborhoods were living crappy lives, and they couldn't break the cycle, and they couldn't own their homes because of, various social practices that really made it almost impossible for them to own their homes. And so they were at the mercy of their landlords and at the mercy of merchants who gouged them and at the mercy of crappy schools that, the city didn't come and repair, and at the mercy of city services like a pool, which I write about, called the Taylor
Yes.
Pool, which was closed and never reopened. And so they didn't have, a basic facility that in other neighborhoods in the city, they had swimming pools, indoor swimming pools, but in this neighborhood they didn't because, the city just wouldn't get it fixed. Um, so this was this is kind of what the riot was about. It was a cry for help.
Wow.
And
So do
and
you
I think
think
I think that it's fair to say about all those riots that that's what they were.
wow. Now do you think this cry for help and this push, this hope that caused the cry for help and the push for the riots, and I would say if it was supposed to be a protest, but I don't know, people got violent, they turned into a riot. Would you say it is, is what most people tend to misunderstand about that period in history? Or is there something else that you think people tend to misunderstand about that
Well,
period
it
in
wasn't. It
history?
was not a one-off. There was a period there when every summer you could kind of expect, the inner cities to blow up, and there was a lot of it. It
Yes.
hasn't. It has. That's an interesting. We haven't seen it in recent years, and I wish I could come up with a pat reason why that's the case, but I can't. Um, I'm sure sociologists are writing about this right now, coming up with perfectly valid reasons, but sitting here and talking to you, I can't say. But boy, they just kept going on. And they were the subject of my master's thesis. They were what I came to Washington to do research on. And I spend 3 weeks in the bowels of the National Archives going through boxes and boxes of documents that had been
Yes.
compiled by a blue ribbon commission called the Kerner Commission, which was led by Otto Kerner, who had been governor of Illinois. And it studied the riots in 30 or 40 cities across America, including, the big ones that everybody has heard of, like Watts and Detroit, and not Chicago, because there were bigger ones than them. And and my research was to go through these documents, which had been when the Kerner Commission finished its work, the documents were sealed and sent to the National Archives, as a repository. And they only had been unsealed the week before I got there. And I was actually the first outsider ever to see these things. And so that's something I'm, a little bit proud of. It's something, nobody else can claim. Um, but these were about riots, big ones in Newark, in Detroit, which I covered, Milwaukee, which I covered, Chicago, of
Wow.
course, which I covered endlessly, Watts in Los Angeles, which was terrible, um, and Detroit, which I covered, which was actually the worst of them all because 37 people died in Detroit, which was the most, was the highest body
Wow.
count of any of these things. Yeah.
So, Frank, at a deeper level, do you think storytelling helps us process history or question it?
Do I think it helps? I think it's essential. Um, they say the pen is mightier than the sword. I think narrative is what makes the world run. I think story has been what captures people's imagination and opens their eyes to the possibilities around them, from the time cavemen sat around campfires and told stories, made up
Yes.
stories about the gods and the stars and what they might have meant, or the animal spirits or whatever it was they talked about. Um, I I think it's impossible for humans not to tell stories, and stories help us understand the world that we live in, not because they're true or false, but because they help us, see the order that underlies what might otherwise just be viewed as chaos.
Wow.
And I
Thank you so
love
much for
telling
that,
I
Frank.
love telling stories, as you can see. When
Yeah.
half the questions you've asked me, I resort to telling a story instead of
And
answering the question directly.
I actually do enjoy your stories, Frank. I've
Well,
actually learned a
thank
lot
you.
from this
Thank you.
short conversation. So, Frank, I want to ask you some rapid fire questions. You can either answer with a phrase or a sentence. So the first one is memory or and now before I ask you rapid fire, you can either pick one or the other option. And if you can't pick any one
Okay.
of them, just know that both of them are available. So the first one is
Okay.
memory or interpretation.
Haha. Apples and oranges, huh? Do you walk to work or carry your lunch? Do you walk to work or carry your lunch? Uh,
Yeah.
memory or interpretation? Oh, heck. Uh, Does it have to be so hard for the first question? Memory or interpretation? My golly. Uh, uh, oh, poo. Let's say memory.
Memory. Okay. Awesome. Now, truth or perspective.
Well, you can't have perspective without truth, and you can't have truth without perspective. Truth
Simple.
or perspective? Um, this is another one just like the first one, truth or dare.
Yeah.
Truth or perspective? Well, I think I go with truth.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Now,
If
past
if
or
if it can be
present?
known, if truth can be known.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know that truth can be known in every, I know it can't be known in every circumstance, but I know we can always seek to know it and strive to know it.
Yes, actually. Now, conflict or understanding. I mean, this is obvious. Definitely understanding.
Mhm. Well, understanding wins that one, but you can't have understanding until there's been conflict.
That's true. That's true. So, what is one word you would use to describe history?
Lesson.
Wow. Oh, wow. It's absolutely mind blowing. I think one of the reasons why we human beings tend to, repeat history is because of the fact that, first off, we don't live long enough. Now, stay with me, Frank. Let me explain why I think it's like that. So, what I think is, when you give birth to your son or your child, you live up to a certain age, and we all die and we leave the earth. The child continues. It's as if the cycle of human nature never changes. It's one of the only things in this world that is constant. Greed, love, fear, hate, they all remain the same across thousands of years when it comes to humanity. And when a child is born, he grows up, he makes mistakes, he learns eventually. But the thing is, usually most of the time they learn later in life when they're like maybe some people in their late 30s, some even 40s. And at that point, they try to, after learning all the mistakes they made, they spend the rest of their life trying to atone for the mistakes or trying to correct the mistakes they made. And this cycle just continues with every human being that's born on earth. So I think it's one of the reasons why history tends to repeat itself. I think it just has to do with human nature essentially. I'm led to believe if human beings lived very long or probably were immortal, there would be lots of people. Imagine somebody that has lived for thousands of years guiding me through phases of my life. I don't think I'll be making stupid mistakes. So I'm just guessing. I don't know. I'm open to to being corrected.
Well, I think that's what I meant when I came up with lesson. Um, I don't think it's a great idea to dwell too much on the past in with, obsessively trying to fix it because you'll just,
Yes.
you'll experience analysis paralysis. We have to keep going forward, but we must spend some time in introspection. We have to, because if we don't, uh, we're just, we learn nothing. If we don't learn from our mistakes and from our successes, we learn nothing. And if we don't spend some time thinking about them without letting them drag us down into immobility, um,
Yes.
we aren't realizing our true potential. Um, but I was thinking it when you were formulating the question, I was thinking about the word wisdom kept coming back to me. They say wisdom is what you get, when you get old. Well, I'm old, and
Yeah.
and I think I know what they're talking about. Um, I've just seen the movies all before. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, I've seen this movie before. And
Wow.
Mark Twain, one of our great writers, said something marvelous, which I think is very relevant to this conversation. He said, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes."
Oh
And
wow.
I just think that's so perfect, because it isn't going to necessarily be precisely the same as it was in 1917 or 1949, but there's enough about it that's similar to make that there's a lesson to be learned from what happened in 1917 or 1949, and that
Frank,
you should be mindful of them when you can conduct yourself in the present moment.
Frank, this has honestly been a very, very fascinating conversation. I've enjoyed my time with you. I've enjoyed your stories, and I just love the fact that having lived through so many years and you have so many experiences, you have so many stories. If I had wanted to listen to more of your stories, honestly, we would never. I don't think we'll be able to end this podcast. It's maybe too long an episode,
Well, if you want to read,
and
well, if
I've had a lot of fun
you
with
want
you.
more of some of my stories, and here comes the commercial. Um, you can go to my website, which is frankjoseph.com, and learn all about my novels, the Chicago
Yes,
trilogy novels, or go to your local bookstore and buy them. I don't know how it would be in Nigeria. It might be a little bit more difficult than it is here, but here you can go into any bookstore
yes,
or Amazon. Amazon, of course, is everywhere, and get any or all of the books. And if they don't have them, they can order them. Might take a little longer where you are, probably take a good deal longer, but I'm sure it can be done. Um, or they can send me an email at
yes.
frank@frankjoseph.com, and I will put my autograph in a copy and mail it to them wherever they are in the world, Nigeria or wherever they are. Um, but the novels are called to what the titles of the novel are from the Old Testament, the book of Micah, chapter 6, verse 8. What doth the Lord require of thee? To do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. And those are the titles of the novels, to love mercy, to walk humbly, and to do justice. And once again, it's frankjoseph.com, www.frankjoseph.com, where you can learn more.
Wow, awesome. Once again, Frank, thank you
Yeah.
so much for coming on my
But let
podcast.
me,
Thank
but
you for the time.
I don't want to leave without, thanking you for having me here, because this has really been
Okay.
one of the most thoughtful conversations I've had doing podcasting.
Oh
Uh,
wow,
and
Frank.
I
I
thank
am
you for
honestly
it.
honored that you said that. Thank you so much.
Well, I
Wow.
thank you for it too. I really do.
Thank you so much, Frank. I haven't made the time yet. And thank you. Thank you once again, Frank. Do
Thank you.
have a
And thank
wonderful
you.
day, Frank, and please do take care of yourself.
Thank you. You too.
All right, Frank. Bye bye.
Bye bye.